I have read a lot of Isekai stories. Your Sword Art Online's, your Konosubas, your Overlords. And one of the questions I've had when experiencing the stories is, what happens at the end? For those who don't know, Isekai means transported to another world, whether that be magically, through reincarnation, or even time travel. Often this means the main character has knowledge of their previous life, and use that information to get ahead, but it isn't required. Not only is this one of the most popular genres of anime, manga, and light novels currently, but it's also one that has deep roots in the role-playing game genre of video games and tabletop games. Think Final Fantasy and Dungeons & Dragons, respectively. There's guilds, leveling, hit points, and skills. All the mechanics you'd expect from RPGs, which is probably one of the biggest draws considering how popular RPGs and TTRPGs are and have been. So, now that you're all caught up, let's ask a question. Does the hero go home after finally accomplishing their quest? Do they die? Maybe they just get trapped in the world and live out their lives. This question fascinates me, since Isekai is so relatively young, and that means that few series have actually finished yet, so we don't have these answers. There's some that are getting close, and I imagine there are some that have completed that I'm just not aware of yet. Or even ones from the past that have already finished, like .hack or something, which is technically Isekai, but not really. But the reason I ask is because the ending really is what the entire story can pivot on when going from jaw-dropping and enjoyable fantasy to, well, Mass Effect 3. For those that don't know, and without spoiling anything, the ending to Mass Effect was promised to be more than a choice between A, B, and C, specifically. And with a story that offers varied ways of companions living and dying and your decisions mattering, it was that much more gobsmacking that it ended exactly with that A, B, and C choice that made everything you'd done up to that point, well, pointless. No matter what you did, who you choose to save, and everything that you decide in the game, that choice would always be there at the end. But that's interactive media, so maybe it's not right to say it's similar. So how about we talk about something that is similar with an example in anime? I'm sure there's plenty of series out there that you felt rocked on hardcore throughout the entire show, but tripped up at the ending and fell flat on its face, leaving you feeling kinda sad or even sick at what the entire ride was leading up to. Personally, that's how I felt about Darling in the Franxx, especially after episode 15 was so good. So if you're still following me and can see what I mean, let's speculate on the ending to a popular Isekai anime, Re:Zero. Now, there will be spoilers for this show, inevitably, so if you haven't watched it, first of all, how dare you? And why are you here in an Isekai video? And second of all, not really, that's just a joke. So let's say Subaru eventually hits all his checkpoints, leaving behind a few dead or brain-damaged friends behind walls he can't return to. He wins, saves the day, the world's no longer under threat, and his harem of girls, or just Amelia, are all still around. Or maybe they aren't around. Maybe Subaru eventually becomes a god, or a reincarnation of a witch, or just a tool used to bring about destruction. I mean, if you think about it, what's the end game for this series? Personally, I think he might end up as a reincarnated version of the witch's husband, with Amelia being the witch. But let's just say that doesn't happen. So what does? Well, for an example more rooted in traditional tabletop gaming, D&D usually ends a number of ways. Either the heroes sacrifice themselves to save the day, they win and everything's hunky-dory, or they become exactly what they're trying to stop. But it's also possible to become a god, too. However, there is a million billion ways it could go, but that's generally what ends up happening. So what's Re:Zero's best ending? And what could make you feel that sickness and sadness I mentioned earlier? Is it Subaru dying? Maybe Subaru becomes mind-controlled and kills his harem in the end. Would that make you feel bad? What about if he became Beetlejuice, like he actually did in the series? What if we get to see all the bad ends he made in the end? Or what if it was all just a dream, or a video game played by Subaru in a delusional state? Would that feel bad? Sure, there's lots of ways it could turn out to be a good show through and through, if you enjoy it in the first place anyway. But there's also a good chance that it ends unsatisfactorily. Let's move to another example. Something more lighthearted and twin to Re:Zero in a lot of ways. Konosuba. What's the end goal for Kazuma? Clearly it's a comedy, so I doubt it'll end up being entirely too serious. But what would be a fitting end to the Konosuba series? Should Kazuma end up staying forever in this world with a useless goddess? After all, he's died quite a few times. Surely that can't keep continuing. Or can it? Maybe he just never dies truly, and he's stuck with these fools the rest of his natural life, at which point he dies and gets sent with them to a new world to do it all over again. Like Cyberpunk. Imagine that for a second. Just imagine. Think. Wouldn't that be cool? But is a never-ending story a good one? It's possible, considering how long One Piece or Gintama have and are probably going to go despite their creators saying they're both reaching the end. Maybe a lot of these isekai end up just ending on a note as if, and their story continues in a new world. After all, it happened once, so why can't it happen again? In fact, that's the premise of a light novel I've recently read called A Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time, since he died early twice and ended up reincarnated for a third time. But even despite reincarnating twice already, it's still pretty entertaining. Since the previous lives were, one, touched on briefly in one chapter, and for the second one, only a few chapters more, it wasn't as exhausting as living through, say, 2 entire Nights and Magics, or, smartphone. In fact, a cool feature about the light novel story is that the previous lives actually affect what the main character goes through directly, through characters and events from these past reincarnations. I won't say any more on account of it being spoilers, but I will mention that the light novel is currently being adapted as a manga, so if you can't find or just don't enjoy light novels themselves, you can get the goods visually as well. And who knows, maybe it'll eventually be another anime I'll cover as a fun isekai to watch. But like I said at the beginning, there are actual examples of isekai ending, with a big one in the form of the classic Sword Art Online. Love it or hate it. Kirito gets trapped in the game world, so it's technically isekai, and has to fight his way to the top, or near it, and defeat the final boss. A trope that is reminiscent to the Demon Lord of Konosuba's eventual goal, and the potential witch last boss of RE0, or whatever they're going to be using for their big bad. The final goal, standing in their way, and after that's complete, well, at least in Sword Art Online's case, Kirito wakes up. He goes home. But his adventure isn't over, because there's always another threat, and more money to be made with the new series. The upcoming Alicization is a perfect example of the never-ending story, but whether that's told well or not is up to you. Whatever you think about it though, Sword Art Online is a good example of what's likely to be the endings of these shows in its various seasons. Beat the enemy, wake up. Beat the enemy to get your friends back. Solve the mystery and keep your loved ones safe. A lot of writers have a preference for these happy endings, or at least hopeful endings. And from what I can tell, based on all the isekai manga, anime, and everything that I've read, Japanese writers aren't that different, at least for the most part. And all of this is while the previous choices have an impact on the story, like Kirito's preference for the sword in GGO, or his incredible stats in Alfheim Online thanks to his time in SAO. So if there's always new threats and worlds to face off against, and the writer's willing to make more, what's a good thing you can do? Well, there's always the option of creating a spin-off if you don't want to actually continue the story, like Konosuba already does. Or just use the same world with different characters years later, but have the old ones show up as a cameo later maybe, which is how the TTRPG show Critical Role handled retiring their heroes once they faced off against the ultimate big bad they had. Even inside the series itself of Critical Role, the threats continued to escalate until legitimate gods were fought. So starting over at zero, just like the title of RE0 is meant to represent, and working your way up from that, even in the old world with events from your past affecting what you're stepping into now, is certainly an option. So what are my endings I'd want for series like these? Well, I'm generally a sucker for the happiest endings, just like those writers I was mentioning before, since I'm also a writer. But while my heart leans that way, I think Subaru suffering endlessly until he finally reaches an ending, with just him and Emilia becoming the gods of the new world, for example, perhaps separate but with knowledge of each other's continued existence, would suit the suffering story very well. As for Konosuba, I actually really like the suggestion I came up while writing this, because seeing this cast of stupid characters acting out every TTRPG type, like Cyberpunk or modern vampire stories, sounds like a fucking blast, to be quite honest. But I suppose I can just leave that to my fanfiction and own D&D sessions. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a little different than some of my other videos since I'm tackling a topic that doesn't really deal with one anime, but a genre instead, so I'm actually glad you stuck through it. And on that note, what do you think the endings to all these isekai would be? What would you hate the most, and what would you love the most? I'd like it if you tell me down in the comments below. And while you're there, maybe click that subscribe button and hit that notification bell for instant updates. Of course, if comments aren't enough for you, I've also got a Twitter, and you can always support me on Patreon as well. Either way, whatever ending these isekai have, I hope you always remember to enjoy the way you watch anime. Because as long as you're having fun, that's all that really matters. I'll see you next time.